In 2007, a Connecticut-based businessman named Richard Yandele lost every single McDonald's restaurant he owned. 7 locations across Brooklyn, built over 17 years as a franchisee, all gone in one bankruptcy filing. His attorney didn't call it fraud, and he didn't call it a bad location or bad management or even bad luck. He called it plainly in court filings a classic case of business failure due to undercapitalization. Here's the detail that makes this story worth understanding, even if you've never run a restaurant. When Yandele's bankruptcy went through court-supervised bidding, his 7 restaurants sold for between $600,000 and $1.6 million each. And McDonald's Corporation itself, the same company that had been Yandele's franchisor for 17 years, exercised a contractual right written into his own franchise agreement to simply take back 4 of the 7 locations outright. The franchisee who built the business walked away with nothing. The franchisor walked away with 4 restaurants. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what undercapitalization means in practice, why McDonald's franchise agreements are structured in a way that makes the franchisor remarkably safe even when a franchisee completely collapses, and why this specific failure pattern has kept repeating across the fast food industry for decades since. Richard Yandele became a McDonald's franchisee in 1990, eventually building up to 7 restaurants across Brooklyn, operating under the name Yandele Foods, Inc. Becoming a McDonald's franchisee has never been cheap. Even decades ago, it required a substantial upfront investment covering the franchise fee, equipment, and initial operating capital, on top of ongoing royalty and rent payments owed to the corporation every single month, calculated as a percentage of gross sales, regardless of how profitable any individual location actually was. For nearly 2 decades, Yandele's restaurants operated as a normal, functioning part of the McDonald's system. Whatever eventually pushed the business into bankruptcy wasn't a single dramatic event. It was the slower, less cinematic failure mode that shows up again and again in franchise bankruptcies. A business that never had quite enough capital cushion to absorb a bad stretch, whatever that stretch happened to be, without the whole structure buckling. Here's the part of this story that applies to almost any small business, not just fast food. Undercapitalization doesn't mean a business is unprofitable on a good day. It means the business never had enough of a financial cushion, cash reserves, working capital, borrowing capacity, to survive the inevitable bad stretches every business eventually faces. A slow sales quarter, a costly repair, a rent increase, a downturn in the local economy. A McDonald's franchisee operates with relentless fixed obligations. Royalty payments, typically around 4% of gross sales, are due every month whether the location had a great month or a terrible one. Rent, often structured as a percentage of sales on top of a base amount, is also due every month, because in the classic McDonald's structure, the corporation itself owns or controls the underlying real estate and leases it back to the franchisee. Add labor costs, food costs, equipment maintenance, and required periodic remodels the franchise agreement can mandate, and a franchisee operating with thin cash reserves has very little room to absorb a shock. Once obligations start falling behind, the gap tends to compound instead of close because missed payments trigger late fees, strained supplier relationships, and declining reinvestment in the restaurants themselves, which in turn hurts sales further. Now for the detail that turns Yandele's bankruptcy from a simple business failure into something more structurally revealing. McDonald's Corporation has, for decades, operated on a business model where a substantial share of its own profitability comes not from selling burgers, but from real estate. The company frequently owns or holds long-term leases on the land and buildings its restaurants sit on, then leases that same property to its franchisees, collecting rent, often tied to a percentage of the restaurant's sales, regardless of how the franchisee's own profitability is actually doing. This matters enormously in a bankruptcy. When Yandele's restaurants went to court-supervised bidding, McDonald's Corporation wasn't just a passive creditor watching from the sidelines. It held a contractual right of first refusal, standard language in most McDonald's franchise agreements, allowing the corporation to simply match the winning bid and reclaim the location itself. It exercised that right on 4 of Yandeli's 7 restaurants. The franchisee, who spent 17 years building the customer base, training the staff, and paying rent and royalties every single month, lost the business entirely. The franchisor, which had been collecting rent and royalty income the entire time regardless of Yandeli's profitability, ended up owning the real estate outright. Layer one more detail onto this. Court filings listed McDonald's Corporation itself among Yandeli's creditors and also listed 2 financing companies, Golden Management Acceptance Company and Golden Improvement Company, firms that specifically provide financing to McDonald's operators. In other words, the same corporate ecosystem that franchised Yandeli the right to operate under its name, leased him the real estate, and collected royalties on every sale, may also have been financing part of his operation. When a franchisee in this position fails, the franchisor isn't just losing a tenant. Depending on the specific financing relationship, it can simultaneously be a landlord recovering property, a lender recovering a loan, and a franchisor reclaiming a territory, all from the same bankruptcy. Undercapitalized franchisees collapsing under fixed obligations they couldn't flex around hasn't gone away since Yandeli's case. It's continued to show up across the fast food industry in waves, particularly during periods of rising costs. In the years following the pandemic, a string of major franchise operators across multiple burger and fast food brands filed for Chapter 11, citing a familiar combination of inflation, rising labor costs, and declining foot traffic eating into margins that were already thin before the fixed obligations, rent, royalties, debt service, were even accounted for. Even multi-unit operators with decades of experience and dozens of locations weren't immune. The fundamental math Yandeli ran into in 2007, fixed monthly obligations that don't flex downward when sales soften, has remained the single most common thread running through franchise failures across the industry ever since. Not every franchisee facing rising costs and thin margins ends up in bankruptcy court, and the difference usually comes down to exactly the thing Yandeli's case was named for. Operators who maintain genuine cash reserves, who don't overexpand into new locations faster than existing units can fund it, and who negotiate remodel timelines and rent structures conservatively rather than aggressively, build in the cushion that lets a business absorb 1 bad year, or even 2, without the whole structure collapsing. The franchise agreement itself, the royalty percentage, the rent structure, the right of first refusal, doesn't change based on who's operating the restaurant. What changes is whether the operator behind it built in enough of a buffer to survive the inevitable bad stretch before it arrives. Yandeli Foods Inc. ceased to exist as a McDonald's franchisee after the 2007 bankruptcy. 4 of the 7 Brooklyn restaurants Richard Yandeli spent 17 years building went back to the corporation that had franchised them to him in the first place, at least temporarily, while the remaining 3 were sold off through the bankruptcy process to other operators. Yandeli Foods Inc. ceased to exist as a McDonald's franchisee after the 2007 bankruptcy. 4 of the 7 Brooklyn restaurants Richard Yandeli spent 17 years building went back to the corporation that had franchised them to him in the first place, at least temporarily, while the remaining 3 were sold off through the bankruptcy process to other operators. The pattern his case illustrated: undercapitalized franchisees operating on thin margins against fixed corporate obligations, with the franchisor structurally positioned to recover the most valuable real estate regardless of how the bankruptcy unfolds, has remained a defining feature of franchise economics in the 2 decades since. So the next time someone describes owning a McDonald's franchise as buying into one of the safest, most proven business systems in the world, that's true in the sense that the brand, the supply chain, and the operating playbook are genuinely dependable. But the financial structure underneath that system was never built to protect the franchisee first. Rent and royalties are due every month regardless of profit. The real estate, in many cases, was never actually the franchisee's to lose, because it was never fully theirs to begin with. The burgers were never really the product being sold to the franchisee. The lease, the royalty stream, and the right of first refusal sitting quietly in the franchise agreement, that's the actual business, and it's designed to survive every outcome, including the franchisee's own bankruptcy.